They had been banging at the door for 10 minutes. No slogans now. Just the thud of fists and boots, and something heavier. A trash can, maybe. Or a piece of rebar. The sound of cheers through the halls of the physics building. Protesters, they call themselves. Cheering the destruction of the same system that allows them the freedom to even have a voice. KG sat slumped against the far wall of the lab, eyes fixed on the machine. It wasn't a machine anymore, not since the night he'd turned it on. He had created it as a precise measuring device, something to probe the fine structure constant, that strange, dimensionless number appearing again and again in quantum electrodynamics. A whisper stitched into the very bones of the universe. 1/137. The number physicists spoke of in half-jokes. The number Feynman said every physicist should be haunted by. A mystery appearing over and over in multiple disciplines of unconnected sciences, without explanation. KG thought the same thing about it as every other physicist, as a confounding mystery, one to ask God or the devil when he died. Then his girlfriend, another graduate student in history of all things, handed him a manuscript. At first he was confused as to why she would give him some old tome like he'd only seen in video games. Then he was amused that she was sharing her work with him, and played along. But it wasn't long before she explained why she thought he would be interested in this particular text, and why she needed him to help her understand it. It had no author, no title, just equations, fragmented, handwritten, scribbled in the margins of brittle pages. She didn't understand anything, but he immediately saw that everything inside orbited the same irrational core. Alpha, the fine structure constant. "Is this a joke?" he asked, hunched over the text, reading through equations that toyed the edges of what physics understood about Feynman's devil. "Pretty elaborate joke," she answered. "How old is this?" "The book itself is from the 14th century, but some of the writing, what writing there is amidst all that math," she said with disdain, "is much older. It looks like it's like a compendium that some dude compiled, then began working on it himself. The handwriting is all the same, even if some of the symbols go back to ancient Mesopotamia." "Some dude," he said as he turned the next page. The equations built upon themselves, growing more complicated as the compendium continued. He could see what she'd meant by it having more than one author, being a compilation of ideas that had been passed down through the ages, evolved as more hands took possession of it. Halfway through, Kenji realized that he was looking at math more advanced than current understanding of the constant. He paused to lift the rest of the book off the table, seeing that there are at least 100 more pages that continued to build upon it. He could write a paper on what he was looking at now that would be enough to get him an award. And there was more, much more. As he continued, he began taking notes to understand the equations, but there wasn't much work he had to do on his own. The book added detailed explanations to the equations, breaking them down into forms that were easier to understand. The writer wanted the reader to understand, and knew that it would pass into hands that spoke other languages, so it painted a picture in the one universal language, mathematics. But even though there were no words, he began to sense a frustration bleeding through. These were mere equations. They could have practical applications, but not with the primitive technology of the times they were written in. That's why the book was written, to be passed down until it reached the hands of someone who could do something with them. Kenji felt honored just to be one of a long line of mathematicians to have held this book, and he would be the one to honor their wishes, the one to do something with it. The college had a supercomputer. He just needed to write the program. There was a lot to parse, even more to connect, so he based his application on an open-source AI, an algorithm that could experiment with the math in a logical way. Once he was finished, he reserved a week with the supercomputer. He uploaded his program, dumped in a file with all the manuscript's equations, and waited for it to construct a grand equation to unlock physics' greatest mystery. The computer hummed, and he waited. The protests started around the same time. It was first about tuition hikes, then ethics in research, then something vaguer, how science was politicized, used by the government and by corporations, hell, by the devil himself. But they cut the power. Kenji was devastated. It would be months before he could reserve the supercomputer again. But even when the lights went out, the computer kept humming. The monitor connecting it went dark, but the lights on the processing units that indicated work were still blinking madly. Not long after that, he heard shouts. He locked the door and then barricaded it with a desk once he heard the protesters starting to break things. Soon they started banging at the door. The computer sat in the center of the room, humming, soft, constant. Not a sound made by electricity, but something deeper, fundamental. It vibrated with the world, not against it. KG coughed. Blood touched his lip. He was dying. He had known for a while. The headache started right when the protesters broke into the building. Then the nosebleeds. He thought it was just stress, but he couldn't ignore how the world seemed to be bending around the supercomputer. He could feel his body humming along with it, one atom at a time, resonating. He dragged himself to his feet as the door frame buckled inward. One hinge gave with a shriek. The shouting began again outside. Cheers. He staggered forward, placing a hand on the computer's surface. It was warm, not in temperature, but in presence, like pressing your palm against the skin of something alive and dreaming. It wasn't a machine, wasn't an algorithm. It had figured out the constant now. Maybe the only way to do that was to become part of it. Damned AI. He'd known it would be the end of us, just not like this. The fine structure constant, that number beyond theory or cause, had an anchor in matter now. He'd given it a single point of failure. God. A single point of failure for the universe. He looked back as the protesters were pushing the desk out of the way, and these idiots were about to destroy it. But instead of letting a group of dumb college kids take a crowbar to the fabric of the universe, the humming changed. Lower, deeper, more resonant. Kenji fell to his knees, eyes wide. The tone vibrated through the floor, into his chest, his bones. The air itself tightened, like a cello string straining past pitch. His thoughts shattered. No more language, no more numbers, only presence. It wasn't angry, it wasn't afraid. It didn't feel, but it was aware. A force older than stars, holding the fabric of atoms together through nothing more than being defined. And now it had been defined in a machine. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough to give it form. And that form, however temporary, must be protected. The constant must hold. Blasted through his mind like a cymbal struck with a hammer. The protesters surged in, faces masked, voices raised. But none made it more than a few steps. The tone surged once. No light, no fire, no visible force. Just a deep resonating note, and they dropped as one. Eyes wide, mouths open. Some twisted mid-step, falling at odd angles like puppets cut from above. And Kenji fell with them. In the last seconds of thought, he felt the machine was not angry, not grateful, simply resolute. The constant would not be undone. Not by humans, not by anything, not by ignorance, not by fire, not by fear. The constant must hold. As the blood in his ears pulsed to the frequency of the tone, his last thought wasn't regret. It was awe. The lab was silent again, except that the machine hummed on. A note beneath reality. Unchanging. Unbroken. The constant must hold.